Hi there, and welcome to this webinar with me, Arthur Moore from Tutorful, talking about how we can explain cognitive science techniques to our parents and students. So we've spoken a lot in these webinars about the techniques that we can use in our sessions with our students, and we've talked a lot about how we need to explain those techniques as we go. And that's what this webinar is specifically focusing on. Very quickly, my name is Arthur Moore. I'm a full-time online maths tutor and have been since 2021. Before then, I was a secondary maths teacher and taught a range in schools across the UK and internationally, including boarding schools, all-full schools, state schools, big schools, small schools, a full range of schools. Since 2021, I have been a full-time tutor with my outfit of More Edu, which in 2024 meant I was the winner of the Professional Tutor of the Year, run by the Tutors Association. I also run Navigated Tutor, which is a platform for tutors to develop as educators, and that's been nominated for several awards, including in 2025 being shortlisted for Educational Resource Award, Resource for Tutors. That's enough about me. Let's get into it. So our aims for today's session. We want to explain why we need to discuss the ideas we've talked about across these webinars with our parents and our tutees, and discuss in some ways that we can actually do this with them. So the why and the how. So firstly, we need to talk about why we actually need to explain these techniques. So we've talked about a range of cognitive science approaches, ranging from the idea of working memory to distributed practice, that we can use in our sessions to increase the impact we are having with our students. And the real question here is, why do we actually need to explain to them? There's a bunch of analogies we can use here, but I'm going to go for this one. Now, there's an old Buddhist parable that goes along the line of, in a distant land, there are 5 villagers who are all blind, and they encounter an elephant for the first time. Intrigued by this, they try to investigate. Now, the first villager, who is blind, touches the elephant leg and says, well, an elephant is like a strong tree trunk. The second villager goes towards the elephant and touches the trunk of the elephant. Now, they don't believe what the first villager said, because what they feel is completely different. And they say, no, this elephant is like a snake. It's long and thin. These two reports completely conflict one another. So the third villager comes in, trying to clarify what's going on. They feel the ears of the elephant, and they say, you are both wrong. This elephant is kind of like a fan. It's like a giant leaf that's going to fan us with some wind. The fourth villager is even more confused now. They approach the elephant, and they end up touching the tail of the elephant. And they're like, no, the elephant, this is more like a rope. So we've got 4 completely different things. The fifth villager, completely confused, turns up and says, you're all wrong. He touches the body of the elephant. This elephant is like a wall. So we've got 5 different people who are all touching the elephant, but all have completely different ideas of what an elephant actually is. And what this story is supposed to show, and the reason I've chosen today, is sometimes we are so in our own space and our own environment that we can't actually take a step back and look at the whole picture. And this happens a lot with our students. So, for example, they think they know how to learn because they've got experience of that from their experience of school or life. But they might only be touching the trunk of the elephant. We, with a bit more experience in education, having taught loads of students in loads of different ways, we've maybe touched more bits of the elephant. So we have a better all-round picture of what's going on. And that's kind of what these webinars have been like. One webinar might only have been looking at one aspect. Another webinar might have only been looking at the ears of the elephant. But if we take a step back, we can look at the whole picture. And it's our job to then communicate that picture to the elephant. To the students, about the elephant. Apologies there. And here's a quote from John Lotsky from 2013. Teaching students how to study is just as important as actually teaching them the content. I think this is so important for us as tutors because we're so well placed to help our students develop as learners. They are getting, a lot of our students who are in school are getting the content delivery. They're getting that content. Yes, we absolutely are helping them with that and we're helping them with content. But what we can also do is talk to our student, especially one-to-one when you're working with them, about the ways in which they can learn more efficiently and effectively. If we go all the way back to the first webinar, Introducing Cognitive Science, we spoke about teaching efficiently and effectively to our students. And we need to teach our students how also to do that. And part of that is communicating why and how we're going to do this. And that's why this idea of why explain is so important, because we need our students to understand what we're doing rather than just doing the stuff we're telling them to do. We think back to some of the ideas we talked about in one of our webinars on distributed learning. Interleaving, promoting learning over performance, sometimes feels counterintuitive, and we need to be able to explain that to our student so we get their buy-in, so they're all in. And also we need to explain it to the parents or the adults or the carers we're working with in that situation. And it all comes down to this idea of I'm doing this because the reason I am doing this technique is because it is going to have this effect on you. And that's a really powerful sentence for us as educators to be aware of. Another reason we need to explain why is it can be hard for us to change our mind. We've done some work in these webinars. If you remember the rule we did where the numbers were going up, and we spoke about how it can be very hard once we've got an idea to change our mind. And I've got another story here. Now, this is a bit of an urban legend. We're almost certain it didn't happen, but the story conveys some of the ideas I'm going here. So it's a story about a radio transmission between a US Navy ship and a Canadian Coast Guard. And the American ship says to the American Coast Guard, you need to divert 15 degrees to the north, otherwise there's going to be a collision. The Canadian voice replies, we recommend you change your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. The American battleship comes back saying, this is the captain of a US Navy ship. I'm telling you to divert your course. The Canadian voice comes back and says, no, no, no. I will say again, you need to divert your course. And the American voice says, this is the aircraft carrier, the USS Lincoln, the second largest ship in the US Navy. We are accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vessels. I'm telling you, nay, I am demanding that you change your course 15 degrees to the north. Otherwise, there will be a collision, and we will undertake the necessary steps to ensure the safety of our crew. And the Canadian voice replies, I hear you. It is your decision. We are a lighthouse. Now, what that story is trying to show here is it's very hard to change our mind. And part of being able to change our mind is having all the information. The ship in this case had a very narrow perception of what was going on. Once it got more information, it realized that it had to make the choice. Now, this is almost certainly an urban legend, but the story emphasizes that unless we take a step back, it can be very hard for us to change our mind. And our students need to know this as well. So I'll give a couple of examples here. So I would often talk to my students about the idea of retrieval strength and storage strength. Retrieval strength, as we've learned for previous webinar, is how easy we are able to recall information, and storage strength is how well that information is staying. So if something has a low retrieval strength and a low storage strength, it might be what we ate for dinner a week ago. It's quite hard to remember that, and it's not been stored. It wasn't deemed important information, so it wasn't being stored. And an example I would do this is I would ask my student to do this. Can you tell me what you had for dinner last Thursday? Then I would say, well, can you tell me your school email address or your email address or maybe your tag on Instagram? Something that has high retrieval strength because they're looking at it a lot and also has high storage strength. I then ask them to remember something they've done recently. So I often do this when a student comes back from holiday. What was the name of your hotel? But that's really, they can retrieve that quite quick because they've used it a lot. But that's not going to be stored. If I ask them a month time, they're probably going to have forgotten that. And I can also ask them, what's your password on your phone? High storage strength, but that's probably not going to last when we get a new phone. We change our storage. So you could ask the difference here between your current passcode and your last passcode. I can't remember my last one, but I can remember this one. And what this is doing is just highlighting to our students that different memories are stored differently and are able to be retrieved differently. Now you can change these 4 examples for whatever works for you. But the idea of highlighting to my students that different things have different storage strengths and that therefore all memories are not equal. And I will do this quite often with my students, but I may do it around a specific topic. So in maths, I might say like, let's do some things that you can recall instantly. And let's talk about why you find other things harder to recall. Maybe it's the thing. So I could talk about the thing we just did in class is very easy to remember. But the thing we did last week is actually quite difficult to remember. That thing you've done repeatedly, what is a triangle, very easy to remember. But something you've stored that is quite hard to retrieve, the definition of a trapezium, might be slightly harder. So we can talk about how these things that we know are remembered and stored differently. Another example of why and how I do this is we've spoke about this image a lot from Tom Sherrington, a model for learning processes, which you can find at the link below. We've talked a lot about this model, so I'm not going to go into this model again. They're in the previous webinars, but I will show this to my student. I show this to my student and I say, this is why we forget things. And this is the process that we are trying to strengthen. So when I'm focusing on things that you remembering stuff, this is why I'm doing it. When I talk about remembering and the things that you have in your brain, this is why. When I talk about how you need to pay attention to this specific thing, this is why I'm doing this. And I show this model to students of pretty much all ages I work with. And I also show it when I have conversations with parents. This is why we're doing certain these things. And this has the added benefit of showing the pupil and the parent that I really care and take pride in the craft of what I do, the craft of teaching. We've talked about pedagogy as the art and practice of teaching. And we've talked about a lot about the practice, but this is showing to my stakeholders, essentially, that I take pride in what I do. And I really focus on it. And the students, these models, they really work for the student. And we combine this with practical examples of things that you're thinking of right now and things that you're remembering. And it really emphasizes students the difference between the two. Another example, and again, something we spoke about a lot today, is this Ebbinghausen's curve of memory. Again, I'm not going to go into this into detail. We've looked at it in previous webinars, but I will show this to my students. So when they say, oh, why are we going over this again? I will say, this is why we are going over stuff again, because you will forget stuff. That is completely normal to forget stuff. So we're trying to think about ways that we won't forget things. And by showing diagrams like this one, I'm highlighting to people that there is reason that I'm doing this. And that's really important for this stuff. So it's not just saying, I'm doing this because I say so. I'm doing this because I think this is going to help you. And stuff like, the reason I really like this one is students often talk to me a lot about, like, I can do it in class. I can't remember it when it comes to the test in a month's time, in 6 months' time, the end of year test. So they understand that they forget things. They have quite a strong understanding of that. And parents understand that. We can all do that because we all forget things. Whereas where we start to speak like this, you get a lot of, oh yeah, that makes sense. If I want to learn a song off by heart, I listen to it more. And the same idea applies for learning a definition in science, a quote in English. And when we use examples like this, we are showing our student that there's a reason we are doing this stuff. Now, if anyone's on live on the webinar and has a question, just give you a moment to put the question in. If you're watching this as a recording, I still suggest that you write down any questions you might have. It's a great way of kind of keeping those in your working memory, but also we can reflect upon them at the end. If I haven't answered any questions, you can come and find me on LinkedIn and ask me those questions. So I'm just going to give everyone a moment just to think of any questions. Okay, so someone's asked a question of, do I actually show models like this? Absolutely. Absolutely, I show these kind of models to my things. The reason I like something like the Ebbinghaus curve is there's no information, like there's no time data, there's no percentages, stuff like this. It's a very basic understanding of what's going on, but that's all we need to start with. And the student read ideas, and even something like this, the more complicated example here, I talk my students through this. So I might break it down. So I might not show it all in one go. I might break it down to help with the working memory. And with some students, I might just focus on a specific area. So I may say to some students, like, the thing you are holding in your head right now is this thing we call the working memory. And that's what you're paying attention to. So if you're flicking on other things, we're just taking up space of that. So for example, with this student, I might say like we're trying to focus on this, but if you're using up this much for your phone and this much because the dog's making noise and this much because you're worrying about what's on TV tonight, then we have limited space. So I want more focus on this. So I want to draw your attention. With the older students, when they're really specifically talking about this is the thing I struggle with, then we'll talk about this model of how we can strengthen this bit by retrieval practice. And like models like this, I find useful to just testing students on their memory and then saying, this is why you have different strengths of retrieval. So like, why can you remember your address, but you can't remember a quote from Macbeth? Because they're about the same length. They're about the same length, aren't they? Well, let's talk about actually why the thing you've used more and has higher storage and retrieval, you're able to remember more. And it's just a way of showing the student that it's not, as sometimes thought, like, I can't remember this. What is wrong with me? Saying like, this is just how the brain works. This is how we all work. And we're going to talk about ways that we can kind of combat that rather than saying, oh, you should never forget things. And I often find it helps students understand kind of they're not being lazy or stupid because they can't remember stuff. It's just how the brain works and how the brain filters out information. And we can talk about ways to strengthen certain memories. And that really helps with a lot of my students. Really nice question. So some other ideas of how to use these ideas in your tuition. These are quite often just some phrases that I bring to my tutoring quite often. And I just find these phrases really helpful. So a phrase like, the reason I'm doing this is. So when I start with an activity that's unrelated to maybe the thing they've been doing in class or the thing they wanted to focus on, they might get some resistance of, I want to focus on this. Go, absolutely, we're going to focus on that. But the reason I'm doing this is I want us to remember what we did a month ago, because you remember that curve I showed you? I just want to get a quick moment where we remember that stuff. And that's going to help us remember it for your test in 2 months' time. The reason I'm doing this is all those quotes are quite hard, easy to forget. So I'm just going to go over some of these really quickly to just give ourselves a little memory. The reason I'm doing this. So that idea of giving a reason helps the students understand that I'm not just aimlessly doing something and not listening to them and not thinking what's best for them. I'm saying that I'm doing this because I'm going to help you. Can you prove to me? So I especially do this with anything to do with kind of memory. So rather than using the phrase, do you remember? Do you remember this? And the student goes, oh, yeah, sure. I remember that. I say, can you prove to me that you remember by completing this missing word activity? Can you prove to me you remember by labeling this diagram? Can you prove to me you remember by writing down that formula? So I'm not relying on the student's acknowledgement of what they know and don't know. It's a very hard thing for our students to do, or for all of us to do, is be aware of what we don't know, which kind of makes complete sense. Like, we don't know what we don't know. So rather than saying to my student, oh, do you remember this? Can you remember this? I say, can you prove to me you remember this? And just that slight change of syntax, that slight changing of the phrasing puts the emphasis on the student to show me that they can remember. And then if they can't remember, there's no disagreement of why we're doing this. We're doing it because you've proven to me you can't remember, or you've proven to yourself would be a better way of wording that. So I really like this phrase here of just saying, well, can you actually prove to me you remember this? It's just a way to show the student that we're doing these things because we want to be able to remember it later on. So can you prove to me? I talk to my students about the idea of short-term versus long-term. So we can remember stuff very, very well in the short term, but longer term, we might forget some things. And if we're learning stuff in October, for example, in year 11, for a test that's in July, then we need to talk about how we can prioritize the long term over the short term. Whereas if a student is talking to me about they've got a test tomorrow, well, we can prioritize the short term, but we still need to be aware that we're only prioritizing the short term here. So, for example, cramming the night before a test, I mean, it does work, but it's not as good, anywhere near as good as having a long-term plan for how we're going to do it better. So that's a nice little way to kind of phrase it. So I do this quite a lot with my students. I talk about, right, we're thinking about the long term here. Remember, our goal is this test, the 11 plus, whatever. I know I'm coming from that from quite an assessment idea. It might be, remember, you want to get this predicted grade before parents' evening, for example. Or you might want to get this before your UCAS or whatever. But we are talking about prioritizing the long-term learning over short-term performance. And again, once we explain this to our students and to our parents, they get on board because they understand why we are doing something like spaced learning. I'm not doing it because I don't want you to be really good at something now. I'm doing it because I want you to be really good at remembering it in 6 months' time. And that shows everyone, ourselves, our students, the adults who are with them, that we are thinking about the long-term benefits to this student, not just this hour we have with them. I talk a lot about working effectively. So this really works with the older students who have got a lot on. They've got their coursework due, they've got some exams to practice, they've also got all their social stuff going on. I talk about, well, if we can work more effectively by using these methods, you're being more efficient in your learning process. And that is going to have a massive benefit because you'll have more time to do other stuff. So if you're working inefficiently, not effectively, you're going to have to do more stuff. Whereas what we can do is we're still learning the same content, but we're going to do it in a more effective way. And that opens up loads of possibilities for you going forward. I find this really works with older students when I'm trying to emphasize them that the reason I'm doing this is to help them not just prioritize the hour we have. And that's when we can talk about the idea that we need to help our students learn how to study, not just the content. And that idea, when we talk about that, is, well, we're helping you learn more efficiently, more effectively, because that is going to benefit you when it comes to all the goals and ambitions you have. And even when we're working with students who are struggling with kind of coming up with those goals and ambitions, we talk about this idea of working effectively because you will get better at what you do and you will notice those ideas. And what you'll find is as they work more effectively, they completely buy into this because like, oh yeah, I didn't have to revise as much for that test tomorrow because I've been doing my revision over the space of a month, 2 months. Oh, that homework I scored a lot better on because I remembered everything. I didn't have to spend loads of time going back through my notes and stuff like that. And we're helping our students see the tangible benefits of some of the stuff we're doing. I talk about the use of the word impact. We are increasing the impact of our hour together. I especially do this if I'm talking with parents. I want to have the biggest impact on your child with their learning. That's my ultimate goal. And that impact, yeah, we can read about that in terms of confidence, in terms of scores on a test, in terms of how happy they are, how confident, all that stuff, how motivated they are. The impact kind of goes across through those. And I'm using ideas from cognitive science that I know will have a tangible, positive impact upon your child. And that's a really, really powerful message to get across. So the reason I'm recapping stuff that we did a month ago is not because I didn't know what to do for the first 5 minutes of the session. It's because I want your child to remember more stuff going forward. And that is going to have loads of positive impacts because their memory will be more flexible, allowing them to solve different problems. It helps with memory retention. It actually helps them with learning more stuff going on because more learning becomes meaningful to them. You can go and look at that on a previous webinar. But it's all about impact. It helps us become more process focused than outcome focused. A lot of our education system, sadly, is outcome focused. How did you do on this test? And that puts a lot of pressure on these singular moments. Whereas if we're using some of the approaches we spoke about in these webinars, we're taking a step back and looking at a process, a journey of how to get from A to B, A to Z, maybe. A journey of how to get between two things, rather than just focusing on the outcome. And the problem is when we focus on an outcome, it becomes very, very goal orientated. We very much prioritize performance. Have I performed in this moment? Whereas if we focus on the process, the outcome will take care of itself. So when I say to my students, well, why are we focusing on a memory activity? I can say, well, the reason is it will help us remember stuff later on. And that will help your outcome. But if we focus on the process now, the outcome will come from that. So that's something we really need to think about. I talk about how to make meaningful something meaningful to my students, not to me. So in the example I chose here, I spoke about email addresses because that's something that really speaks to us, but it might not speak to our students. So in that example, I might use their tag on Snapchat or on TikTok. I'm showing my age now. But in order for me to make all these ideas we've spoken about meaningful, I need to make it meaningful to them, not to me. So I'm not saying I'm doing cognitive science because it makes me better at my job or better at my tutoring. That doesn't make sense to the student. I'm doing this because it's going to have a greater impact on you. And it's going to have a greater impact because what I've said is being meaningful to them. So be conscious when you're talking about these ideas of making something meaningful to the student, to the parent, not just to you. We've covered quite a lot of content in these webinars, and you've now got a fantastic base of knowledge to kind of go off. But there's no idea, there's no reason to talk about a method such as this one or this one if we haven't clearly explained what we mean by kind of working memory. So there's no point using some of these phrases of working memory and just throwing it out there if we're not explaining to the student what those ideas are. So do I explain what I mean by working memory and long-term memory to my students? Absolutely. I may not just throw it straight in with the key terminology, but explain what I mean by those ideas. Because then what happens is the learning becomes meaningful to them. I repeat a lot of these ideas. So I don't want you thinking I just do in my first tutoring session a quick idea of cognitive science for my students. It's absolutely not what I do. I come back to these ideas again and again. The idea of remembering so you don't forget as much next time, I always mention to my students when we're going back over stuff. When I say, can you prove this to me? And they can't prove it to me. I say, this is not you saying that you couldn't do this. I've got evidence that you could do this. We know you could do this, but you've just forgotten because we all forget things. So the reason I'm doing this is remember that curve we spoke about. I might draw it on. Remember that curve we spoke about? Well, repeating will help us remember more for longer. So repeating these ideas is really powerful. And all these ideas are just about explaining what we're doing to our parents and students. And the reason we're doing that is we're trying to get them to understand why we are doing something. And the reason why we're doing something is we want to have a greater impact with our students. I want you to do better. It's a very powerful thing to say to our parents and students. And by taking some cognitive science approaches, taking a bit of understanding of how we learn, I can help my students progress more. So it's a really when I first went into teaching, cognitive science wasn't kind of the first thing I go to. I always focused on content. Has my side got enough information on? And what I realized I was doing is I was focusing too much on me as the educator. What I was saying, what I was doing. What I wasn't focusing on is the student, because it's their learning that matters here. So everything I do should be in the mindset of what effect is it going to have upon my student and their progress and their confidence and motivation and all the stuff that comes from that. And cognitive science has helped me kind of rechange that mindset. So I am focusing on the student, not on me. So when I'm creating content, when I'm teaching, I'm very much focused on, is this having an impact upon the student? There's no point me saying brilliant stuff if no one's listening. If my student is not paying attention, then there's no point me going there. And I explain this to my students. And that's why sometimes at the start of our sessions, we have chats about how their week have been and what's going on. Because we realize we haven't got that focus. And maybe they want to talk about the football match they've just come out of, just so they can refocus in 2 minutes' time. And just having a cognitive science mindset sometime just helps us refocus on the learning that's taking place. And I find that really powerful. So some of the key takeaways that I really want you taking away from this. We explain to justify why we are doing something. So I'm going to explain to you distributed learning theory very briefly to my students. So I can justify what I'm doing, and that gets their buy-in. I use concrete examples like, can you tell me what you had for breakfast this morning? As opposed to, can you tell me what you had for breakfast last week, last month, a year ago? And let's talk about why you remember some of those things differently. And then we can do different examples of, can you tell me what you did in school in your maths class today, yesterday, last week, last month? And your student will see, why can't I remember stuff for last month as well as I remember today? And that gives us buy-in to how we can remember stuff longer term. And absolutely focus on the benefits of all this stuff. We're doing this because we want to benefit the student. I think it's really powerful to give those concrete examples. I really like the one of can you tell me what you did in class last week? It really emphasizes to our student, and we can make that very specific to our subject, or we can ask it in general. And also it quite clearly shows to the parent that even though their student is working hard in school and hard in the tutoring sessions, that's not enough. We need to think about this kind of long-term approach of how we can help our students learn, as opposed to just focusing on the here and now. And when we talk our students and parents and carers and guardians through that, they understand the place we are coming from. Especially when we're doing stuff that sometimes feels counterintuitive. So why are we doing a random brain dump on a different topic at the end of today's subject? Why are we doing that? Well, we're doing that because I want to see how much you can remember. And by remembering that stuff, you're going to remember it better next time. As always, if you have any questions, please come and find me on LinkedIn. Top right is the best place to find me, or you can search Arthur Moore Tutor. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have. I write fairly frequently about different ideas in cognitive science. You can listen to Tutoring Tips, the podcast, which is where 50 tutors have shared their top tip in tutoring from around the world. You can join a WhatsApp group of over 350 tutors, where from September, we will be sharing a we share a tip a week. We take a break in August, but a tip a week. Or if you want to find out more about what I do with Navigator Tutor, you can find the link there. But today, I really want to leave you with this idea of this one. We explain our ideas to justify why we're doing something, to get buy-in. And it is all about a single word, and that word is impact. How can we have the biggest impact on our students from a learning perspective? And that's something that unites us all. It unites everyone on this call, everyone watching this, everyone in Tutorful, all tutors, and all the parents and stuff we work with. We want to be having the biggest impact with our students, and our students want us to have an impact. If they're sitting down with us for an hour, they don't want to feel like it's having no impact. I'm sure we've all worked with students where once they start to see the impact it's having, we get this big buy-in to tutoring. And it all comes to this idea of impact. And if I was to leave you with one tip, it's just to use this phrase. Can you prove to me you can do this? Prove to me you can do this. It's a really powerful phrase to use in your tutoring. A couple of questions coming in, so I'm just going to answer those from the live chat from people asking questions. But if you're watching it as a recording and you haven't had any of these questions answered, please let me know. So someone was talking about meaningful to them, not to you, and how we do this. What's really nice is some of the examples I use there of like, can you tell me what you can remember? Can you tell me? Because by them vocalizing that, it becomes meaningful to them that what they can't remember. There's no point in me saying, well, I like stuff I can't remember. It doesn't really help with the students. Whereas if we ask them to remember stuff, like it's very clear to them what they can and can't remember. And that's where we can jump in and talk stuff. Another question was this idea about short-term and long-term. Like this is something I talk about a lot about students. The reason I'm doing this is because this is going to have a long-term impact with you. And that's going to have loads and loads of benefits. And it's not, I'm saying we should never do anything that is short-term focused. Like if they've got a test tomorrow, absolutely, I'm not going to do a random class topic from before. I'm going to focus on that idea. But as long as we are aware of that, we are doing that to have a relatively short-term impact. So that's something I really would emphasize. And someone's just asked me to put up this slide again. So this is quite a common idea now in kind of cognitive science and educational psychology of just like the idea of like, we need to also teach the how, not just the content. And we've talked about that ideas with doing brain dumps or different ways we can revise with retrieval practice. We talked about the litmus system for flashcards. Teaching the litmus system for flashcards, there's no content there. We're not talking about the content, but we're giving the students a tool on how to study. And that is really impactful. Some really nice questions there. And someone has just asked, can I put up the slide with this one last time? Absolutely. One of my favorite images, you will see this across all the webinars I use from Tom Sherrington, a model for learning processes drawn by Ali Cav, I believe. It's all available at that blog there. If you typed in Teacherhead or Tom Sherrington, a model for learning processes, that will come up as absolute not my model. So there's the full reference there. That's what the person was asking for there. But that's something I use a lot with my students. I may take out different aspects for different students. But the idea of how the brain kind of stores information is really powerful. Thank you to everyone who joined today. Really appreciate your time as always. Please come and find me on LinkedIn if you have any follow-up questions. I'm always happy to answer those if you were watching as a recording. But thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day. And I hope this has been really useful for you. My name's Alf Moore, and this has been how to discuss cognitive science approaches with our students and our parents. Enjoy the day. Take care. Bye.